Harlem, 1934. The rain did not fall loudly that night. It whispered. It slid down the windows of Lenox Avenue like memory, slow, deliberate, impossible to ignore. Neon lights flickered against wet pavement. Jazz slipped through basement doors. It was a city alive but tense. A city trying to breathe under pressure. And in the center of that pressure stood a man who never raised his voice. Ellsworth. Bumpy Johnson was not the loudest man in Harlem. He was not the tallest. He was not the flashiest. But when he entered a room, conversation adjusted itself. Power, when real, does not announce itself. It settles. On this particular evening, Bumpy sat in a modest back booth of the St. Nicholas Cafe. A newspaper lay folded in front of him. His posture was upright, his suit pressed, his hat resting neatly beside him. His expression betrayed nothing, but the headline did. Harlem Racket Kingpin Under Investigation. A white reporter lingered near the entrance, pretending to stir sugar into his coffee long after it dissolved. He wasn't there for coffee. He was there to watch. Bumpy knew, he always knew. Across from him sat a young man named Clarence, barely 22, ambitious, sharp-eyed, and too eager to prove himself. Hearing whispers about his intelligence, his discipline, his refusal to be sloppy, "Mr. Johnson," Clarence said carefully, lowering his voice. "They're building something." Bumpy did not look up from the paper. They're saying you're connected to the Uptown Numbers arrests last week. They're saying the district attorney wants a public example." Now Bumpy folded the newspaper, once precise, and placed it on the table. "Clarence," he said calmly, "what do men do when they can't control something?" Clarence hesitated. They try to discredit it. Bumpy nodded once, outside. Thunder rolled faintly, distant, but coming closer. The problem was not the accusation itself. Federal eyes were scanning New York harder than ever. Political tension was rising. And certain downtown interests did not like the quiet order. It happened. A police convoy swept through Harlem just after midnight. Doors were kicked in. Storefronts were overturned. Bumpy Johnson. He did not resist when they entered his apartment. He did not argue. He placed his book on the side table, poetry, as always, and stood. "Ellsworth Johnson," the lead officer announced theatrically, loud enough for the hallway to hear. "You are under arrest for racketeering and conspiracy." Bumpy adjusted his cuffs. "Conspiracy requires partners," he replied evenly. "I hope you brought the right ones." The officers smirked, but uncertainty flickered briefly in his eyes. They wanted spectacle. Bumpy gave them composure. When they marched him down the apartment steps, neighbors watched from cracked doors. Some wept quietly. Some clenched fists. Some simply bowed their heads. Humiliation, later, was crowded beyond capacity. Reporters filled the benches. Flashbulbs cracked like small explosions. The prosecution presented documents, financial records, statements, alleged witness testimony. One name echoed repeatedly. Dutch Schultz. The newspapers loved pairing their names. Two men from opposite worlds forced into the same headlines. But what they never understood was this. Bumpy did not build his reputation through chaos. He built it through negotiation. And negotiation threatens those who profit from disorder. The prosecution's star witness was a man named Leonard Pike, a former associate who now claimed Bumpy orchestrated an entire network of underground operations. Pike's testimony was polished. Too polished. He spoke confidently. Hands clenched. Because Clarence knew something the prosecutors did not. 3 days before the arrest, Pike had been seen entering the district attorney's office through a side entrance. Deals had been made. Stories rehearsed, truth rearranged. When it was Bumpy's turn to speak, the room leaned forward. He stood slowly. No dramatic gestures. No raised voice. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, tone steady. "Power without discipline destroys communities. Power with discipline preserves them. A murmur rippled. I have spent years negotiating peace in neighborhoods where others profited from chaos. If maintaining order makes me dangerous, then perhaps we should ask, dangerous to whom? Silence. He did not attack. Doubt entered the room, but doubt is fragile. The judge adjourned without verdict. The tension deepened. Outside the courthouse, reporters shoved microphones forward. Mr. Johnson, are you denying all allegations? Bumpy adjusted his hat. Am denying nothing, he replied. I am observing everything. Breathless, Mr. Johnson, he whispered urgently, I found something. He laid photographs on the table, grainy images of Leonard Pike. Meeting privately with Assistant District Attorney Morris in a dimly lit restaurant. The meeting occurred 2 days before Pike's testimony. Bribery, coercion, leverage. The injustice was clear, but here was the turning point. Clarence expected rage. He expected retaliation. Instead, Bumpy studied the photos quietly. How did you get these? He asked. Clarence hesitated. I paid someone. With what? My savings. Bumpy leaned back. Then we will repay you. And if I respond like a criminal, what will that make me? Clarence's jaw tightened. They're humiliating you. Bumpy's voice softened, not weaker, but, he said. Clarence stared in disbelief. Why not? He stood. Instead, we invite Mr. Pike to dinner. The invitation arrived discreetly. No demands, just a location. Table 7, private. Room. No witnesses. Leonard Pike nearly declined. But curiosity and fear are powerful motivators. The restaurant that night was quiet. Rain tapped lightly against the windows again, mirroring the night of the arrest. Pike entered pale. Bumpy was already seated. A single candle flickered between them. No guards. No weapons visible. Just silence. Pike attempted to speak first. Excuses, justifications, mentions of family pressure. Bumpy raised one hand gently. I am not here to threaten you, he said calmly. I am here to give you back your choice. He slid the photographs across the table. Pike's face drained of color. You see, Bumpy continued softly, they have made you believe that survival requires dishonor. Pike's hands trembled. I survived by learning the opposite. The room felt smaller now, heavier. I will not destroy you publicly, Bumpy said. But tomorrow you will correct your testimony. Pike swallowed. They'll ruin me. Bumpy leaned forward slightly, not aggressive, but steady. Integrity ruins no man. Only fear does. There it was, the turning point. No violence. No threats. Only moral weight. The next morning in court, Leonard Pike requested to amend his testimony. He admitted to external pressure. He acknowledged manipulation. The prosecution's case fractured. Instantly. Reporters scrambled. Headlines shifted. Star witness revises statement. The judge declared mistrial. Outside, Harlem waited. When Bumpy stepped out of the courthouse, no cheering erupted. Just silence. Respectful silence. Clarence stood beside him, eyes wide with admiration. You could have destroyed them, Clarence whispered. Bumpy adjusted his coat. Destruction is easy, he replied. Stability is difficult. As he walked down the courthouse steps, something shifted in the air. He had not just defended himself. He had demonstrated something far more dangerous to corrupt systems. Control. Because power that cannot be provoked cannot be controlled. And Harlem. Bumpy returned to his poetry book and resumed reading from the page he had left weeks earlier. As if nothing had happened. But everything had. Harlem did not celebrate the survival is quiet, but restored dignity, that moves differently. It settles into the streets like fog. He returned to Lenox Avenue the same way he had left it, composed, unreadable, deliberate. But something had shifted, and downtown knew it. The district attorney's office had expected retaliation. They expected Harlem to ignite in protest so they could label it volatile, dangerous, unruly. Instead, Harlem remained disciplined. That was far more threatening, because chaos justifies control. Order demands respect. And respect was something the city had never been comfortable granting freely to a black man who refused to bend. 3 weeks after the mistrial, subtle pressure began. It did not come in the form of raids this time. It came in whispers. Businesses that quietly supported Bumpy's mediation efforts were suddenly audited. Licenses were delayed. Deliveries went missing. Insurance policies were reassessed. Economic suffocation, more strategic than handcuffs, more humiliating than a courtroom, and far more effective. Clarence noticed it first. "Mr. Johnson," he said one evening inside the back office of a neighborhood cafe, "they're freezing people out. Mr. Kaplan's grocery got hit with violations that don't exist. Miss Evelyn's music hall was denied permit renewal. They're choking the neighborhood." Bumpy stood by the window, hands clasped behind his back, watching children play stickball under a fading sunset. "How many?" he asked quietly. "At least 12 businesses. And how many of those are owned by people who refuse to testify against me?" Clarence hesitated. "All of them." There it was, not punishment of the accused, that punishment of loyalty. That kind of injustice cuts deeper, because it teaches a lesson. Stay silent or suffer. Clarence's jaw tightened. "We can fight this. We can expose the pattern." "No," Bumpy said calmly. Clarence blinked. "No, they want noise. They want anger. They want Harlem to confirm their narrative." He turned from the window. "And we will not give them that. But pressure has weight. And weight, over time, breaks even strong backs." One night, an elderly shop owner named Mr. Kaplan came to see Bumpy personally. His hands shook slightly as he removed his hat. "I have 4 grandchildren," he said softly. "If they revoke my license, I lose everything." Bumpy listened without interruption. He did not promise revenge. He did not curse City Hall. He asked one question. "Have you done anything wrong?" Kaplan straightened slightly. "No." "Then we will proceed as if that is the truth." Kaplan's eyes filled, not with fear this time, but relief. Because the calm in Bumpy's voice did something extraordinary. It transferred steadiness. But downtown had another move, and this one was personal. Late one evening, as rain once again polished Harlem's streets in silver reflection, Clarence burst into Bumpy's apartment without knocking, something he had never done before. "They've arrested David," he said breathlessly. The name hung heavy. David Walker was 17. A gifted pianist, raised by his grandmother, no record, no history of trouble. He played Sunday hymns at the church and jazz on Saturday nights at Miss Evelyn's hall, and he had publicly defended Bumpy after the mistrial. The charge? Armed robbery. The accusation was absurd. David had been playing piano during the alleged incident, witnessed by 50 people. But witnesses can be ignored. Narratives cannot. Clarence paced the room. "They're sending a message. They're saying anyone who stands with you will pay." Bumpy closed his poetry book slowly. This was different. This was not about him. This was about the future. An injustice against the young carries a particular cruelty. "Where is he?" Bumpy asked. "Central booking. Has he spoken?" "No." Bumpy nodded once. "Good." The jail smelled of metal and damp stone. David sat alone on a wooden bench, fingers trembling slightly, not from guilt but confusion. His knuckles were scraped, not from robbery, but from being shoved against brick during arrest. When Bumpy entered the visitation area, the guard raised an eyebrow but said nothing. Influence, when disciplined, moves quietly. David looked up, eyes red, but not broken. "I didn't do it," he whispered. "I know," Bumpy replied evenly. There was no dramatic embrace, no theatrical comfort, just certainty. "They said if I testify against you," David continued shakily, "they'll drop the charges." The room went still. So that was the play. Clarence, standing behind Bumpy, clenched his fists. Bumpy remained motionless. "And what did you say?" he asked gently. David swallowed. "I said no." A silence followed, heavy, sacred. Because courage at 17 is not common. Bumpy leaned forward slightly. "You understand what that may cost you?" David nodded slowly. "I'd rather play piano with honest hands." The words struck deeper than any courtroom argument, and in that moment, Bumpy realized something critical. This was no longer a legal battle. This was a moral war. The next morning, Bumpy did something no one expected. He requested a private meeting, not with the district attorney. With the mayor. The mayor initially declined, then reconsidered. Because even politicians understand when a situation is escalating beyond optics. Meeting took place in a quiet office overlooking City Hall Park. The mayor adjusted his cufflinks nervously as Bumpy entered. "Mr. Johnson," he began cautiously, "this city cannot tolerate unrest. Nor can it tolerate injustice." Bumpy replied evenly. The mayor shifted in his seat. "You're implying something serious." "I am observing something serious." He placed a small envelope on the desk. Inside were sworn statements from church leaders, music hall owners, teachers, all confirming David's presence at the piano during the alleged robbery. "Your officers arrested a child," Bumpy said calmly, "not because he stole, but because he would not." The mayor's face tightened. "They are using him to provoke me." The room felt smaller, "and I will not be provoked." The mayor studied him carefully. "What do you want?" "Justice," quietly. "Not headlines. Not scandal. Just correction." The mayor leaned back, calculating political cost versus moral necessity. "You understand," he said slowly, "that if we drop these charges, it will raise questions." Bumpy met his gaze without blinking. "Then answer them truthfully." Silence. Then something shifted. "Because true authority recognizes itself." The mayor exhaled. "I will review this personally." 3 days later, charges against David Walker were dismissed due to insufficient evidence. No apology. No acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Just quiet release. But Harlem understood what had happened, and downtown understood something far more unsettling. Bumpy Johnson had chosen stability. Again, they had expected outrage. They had expected retaliation. They had expected chaos. Instead, he walked into the highest office in the city and spoke with the steady composure of a man who knows he does not need to shout. And that composure forced correction. David returned to Miss Evelyn's music hall. That Saturday night. The room was full. Not celebratory. Respectful. When he sat at the piano, his hands trembled slightly before settling on the keys. The first notes were soft. Then stronger. Then defiant. Music filled the room like restored breath. Bumpy stood near the back wall, hat low, expression unreadable. Clarence leaned toward him. "You could have destroyed them publicly," he whispered again. Bumpy's eyes remained on the piano. "Public destruction would have made this about me." A pause. This was about him. The music swelled. And something invisible but powerful settled across the room. Harlem was learning a new kind of strength. Not explosive. Enduring. Not reactive. Discipline. But the story was not over, because power does not retreat quietly when challenged with dignity. It recalculates. And somewhere downtown, men in tailored suits were realizing a dangerous truth. They could not bait Bumpy into chaos, and a man who cannot be baited cannot be controlled. The storm was not coming in the form of raids anymore. It was coming from within. Harlem did not fear noise. It understood it. Gunshots, sirens, raised voices in alleyways, political speeches on street corners. Those things were visible, measurable, survivable. What Harlem feared was silence that felt different, the kind that suggested something was wrong, but no one could name it. It began subtly. Miss Evelyn S. Music hall started losing performers to downtown contracts that offered impossible money. Mr. Kaplan's supplier suddenly refused credit extensions. Clarence began noticing unfamiliar faces lingering at corners longer than necessary. None of it was illegal. None of it was loud. It was strategic erosion, and erosion does not collapse buildings overnight. It weakens foundations until they fall on their own. Bumpy saw it immediately. He did not comment on it. He watched, because when pressure changes form, you do not rush toward it. You observe its rhythm. But then came something he did not anticipate. Clarence stopped asking questions for weeks. Clarence had been sharp, analytical, restless, emotionally invested. But gradually, his posture shifted. He arrived later to meetings, spoke less, avoided direct eye contact. It was subtle. Most men would not have noticed. Bumpy did. One evening, inside the dim back office of the cafe, Bumpy poured 2 glasses of water and slid one across the desk. Clarence hesitated before sitting. "You've been quiet," Bumpy said calmly. Clarence forced a small smile. "Just tired." "From what?" Silence. The clock ticked loudly. Then Clarence exhaled. "They approached me." The words landed softly, but heavily. "Who?" Bumpy asked. 2 men. Suits. Polite. Said they represented interests downtown. They offered opportunity. Bumpy did not move. "What kind of opportunity?" "They said I'm wasting my potential here. That I could be something bigger, safer, cleaner." "And what did they want in return?" Clarence swallowed. "Information." The air in the room shifted. Not dramatically, but perceptibly. "And did you give them any?" Bumpy asked evenly. Clarence's eyes flickered. "No." It was too quick. Too sharp. And in that single heartbeat of hesitation, Bumpy understood. The quietest knife is the one wrapped in ambition. Clarence was not malicious. He was young. And youth is vulnerable to recognition. Down had not attacked Harlem this time. They had targeted its future for the next week. Bumpy said nothing. He did not confront Clarence further. He did not accuse. He simply adjusted. Meetings were held in smaller rooms. Sensitive discussions shortened. Movements became less predictable. And Clarence noticed. Guilt, when unaddressed, grows louder in the mind than accusation ever could. One night, Clarence arrived unexpectedly at Bumpy's apartment. Rain again, as if Harlem itself remembered tension by scent. "I didn't tell them anything important," Clarence blurted before sitting. Bumpy remained by the window. "But you told them something," he replied. Clarence's shoulders tightened. "I told them about the mayor meeting. About David's case. Things they probably already knew." "You confirmed them." The difference was precise. Clarence ran his hands through his hair. "I thought if I gave them harmless things, they'd stop pushing. And did they? No. Of course not. Because compromise rarely satisfies manipulation. It invites more. They said," Clarence continued quietly, "that if I didn't cooperate further, they would open an investigation into my family's finances, my mother's shop." There it was, fear disguised as pragmatism. "They said you wouldn't blame me, that you'd understand." Now Bumpy turned. "Did you?" Clarence hesitated. "I don't know." And that was honest, which made it worse. The true betrayal did not come through leaked plans or police raids. It came through doubt. Rumors began circulating that Bumpy was negotiating secretly with downtown interests, that he had cut deals, that he had protected his own position while others suffered audits. No evidence. Just suggestion. Suggestion spreads faster than fact. And this time, Harlem did not look at City Hall. It looked inward. Mr. Kaplan asked fewer questions during meetings. Miss Evelyn's tone shifted slightly, respectful but cautious. Even David avoided prolonged eye contact after rehearsals. Trust had been punctured, and trust does not bleed loudly. It seeps. One evening, Bumpy requested a private gathering at Miss Evelyn's hall after closing hours. No speeches were announced. No Agenda was given. When the small circle assembled, Kaplan, Evelyn, David, several business owners. Clarence stood near the back wall. Pale, Bumpy remained seated at the piano bench. He did not play. He simply rested his hands on the keys. I have been accused, he began calmly, of negotiating privately with the same forces that have pressured this neighborhood. No anger, no defensiveness, just clarity. If I had done so, I would not deny it. I would explain it. The room remained silent, but I have not. He stood, and I understand why. Doubt exists. Doubt thrives where transparency fades. He turned toward Clarence. And in that moment, everyone followed his gaze. Clarence's breath caught. Bumpy did not expose him. He did not shame him. Instead, he said something unexpected. Young men are often tested with promises disguised as opportunity. The room shifted. And sometimes, Bumpy continued, fear speaks louder than loyalty. Clarence's eyes filled. But this community, Bumpy said softly, is not built on fear. He stepped forward. If any man here believes I have compromised this neighborhood, speak now. I will answer plainly. Silence. Long. Heavy. Then Mr. Kaplan stood slowly. I do not believe it. Miss Evelyn nodded. Nor do I. One by one, heads lowered in quiet affirmation. Because something extraordinary was happening. Bumpy had not defended himself with documents. He had defended himself with posture. With consistency. With history. Finally, Clarence stepped forward. I told them things, he said, voice shaking. Not secrets, but enough to confirm what they suspected. The room tightened. Bumpy remained still. They promised safety. They threatened my mother. Tears now. Thought I could manage it, control it. I was wrong. He looked at Bumpy directly. I betrayed your trust. There it was, the knife revealed, but it had not cut through flesh. It had cut through illusion. And here was the true turning point. Everyone expected fury. They expected expulsion. They expected Bumpy to reassert authority. Instead, he walked toward Clarence and placed a steady hand on his shoulder. Ambition without guidance is easily redirected, he said quietly. The room stilled. You were not corrupted, Bumpy continued. You were frightened. Clarence broke. Not from accusation, from mercy. You will repair this, Bumpy said calmly. Not by apology, by discipline. He turned to the room. And if downtown wishes to divide us through youth, they misunderstand something fundamental. A pause. Harlem does not abandon its sons for being tested. The words landed deeper than any retaliation could have, because this was not weakness. It was control. Downtown had expected internal collapse. They expected chaos from within. Instead, they witnessed correction without blood. The next morning, Clarence voluntarily approached the same men who had pressured him, not with anger. With resignation. I will not continue, he told them evenly. They smiled thinly. You'll regret that. Perhaps, he replied. But he did not waver, because discipline had replaced fear. And fear, once removed, loses leverage. That week, something shifted again in Harlem. The rumors stopped. The unfamiliar faces disappeared from corners. The economic audits slowed. Because downtown had learned something unsettling. You cannot fracture a structure that repairs itself without spectacle. And Bumpy Johnson had done something rare. He had transformed betrayal into education. He had converted fear into loyalty. He had answered manipulation not with violence, not with exposure, but with visible moral steadiness. And that kind of power is harder to dismantle than any empire. But the pressure was not finished, because when external force fails, it searches for a wound already formed. Winter came early to Harlem that year. The cold did not announce itself with storms. It crept in, through cracked windows, beneath doorframes, across sidewalks where children once played late into the evening. The air felt thinner, conversations shorter. Laughter less frequent. Pressure had not disappeared. It had simply changed temperature. The businesses stabilized. The rumors faded. Clarence had recommitted himself with a maturity that no lecture could have produced. David's music had grown stronger, more defiant, more assured. On the surface, Harlem was steady, but stability, when hard won, carries a price. And that price arrived without warning. It was a Tuesday evening when the call came. Miss Evelyn's music hall had caught fire, not a roaring inferno, not dramatic flames stretching toward the sky, but controlled damage, contained, precise, enough to destroy the piano, enough to ruin the stage, enough to send a message. By the time Bumpy arrived, smoke curled into the winter air like a ghost, refusing to leave. Fire crews had already extinguished the blaze. Police officers stood casually near the entrance, notebooks half open, expressions unreadable. Miss Evelyn stood across the street, coat wrapped tightly around her shoulders. Her face was not panicked. It was devastated. The piano, David's piano, was gone. The instrument that had carried courage, that had filled a room with restored dignity, now sat blackened and split, keys warped, strings exposed like broken ribs. David stood beside it earlier, someone had said. He had watched silently as water soaked into ash. Clarence arrived moments after Bumpy. His breathing was uneven, fists clenched. "They did this," he said under his breath. "They couldn't divide us, so they're burning us." Bumpy said nothing. He stepped across the wet pavement and into the damaged hall. The smell was sharp. Wood and smoke and something final. He walked slowly across the warped floorboards and stopped where the piano had stood. The quiet inside the room was different from any quiet before. This was not tension. This was mourning. Miss Evelyn entered behind him. "They say it was faulty wiring," she said flatly. Bumpy examined the ceiling. The wiring had not been near the stage. The fire had started directly beneath the piano. Intentional. Careful. Humiliating. Because destroying a business hurts. Destroying art humiliates. He turned to Miss Evelyn. "Were you threatened?" She hesitated. "Not directly." He nodded once. "Of course not." Those who orchestrated pressure understood subtlety. They had escalated without leaving fingerprints. And here was the final test. Because this time, there was no courtroom, no meeting with the mayor, no witness to correct testimony. There was only loss, and loss tempts reaction. That night, word spread quickly. Harlem gathered not in protest, but in silence. People stood outside the hall in coats and scarves, staring at smoke-stained brick as though it were a fallen monument. David stood near the doorway long after the fire crews left, when Bumpy approached him. The young pianist did not speak. His hands, the same hands that had chosen honesty over safety, trembled slightly from cold and shock. "They wanted you to react," David finally whispered. Double quotes. "Yes," Bumpy replied. "They want anger." "Yes." David swallowed hard. "Are we going to give it to them?" The question hung between them. This was the moment, the kind that defines legacies. Clarence stood close enough to hear. Others leaned in subtly. The entire neighborhood, in spirit, waited. Bumpy looked at the burned stage one last time, then he turned to David. "Tomorrow evening," he said calmly, "you will play again." David blinked. "Where?" "Outside." Clarence frowned. "Outside?" "Calmly, he said calmly. "You will play again." David blinked. "Where?" "Outside." Clarence frowned. "Outside." "In this cold?" "Yes." He turned toward Miss Evelyn. "We rebuild. But first, we respond." "How?" she asked quietly. "With music." The next evening, Harlem did not gather in anger. It gathered in coats. Chairs were carried onto the sidewalk. Lanterns were hung from windows. Someone brought a smaller upright piano from a church basement, chipped, imperfect, but functional. The burned hall stood behind them as silent backdrop. Police cruisers lingered at the corner, expecting unrest. They received none. David sat at the upright piano in the street. His fingers hovered above the keys for a long moment. Then he began. The first notes were soft, fragile, almost questioning. Then they grew. Stronger, clearer, not defiant in rage, but defiant in resilience. The cold air carried the melody down Lenox Avenue. People stood still, breath visible in winter air, eyes reflecting lantern light. Bumpy stood near the back, hat low, posture steady. Downtown had expected riots. They expected shattered windows. They expected confirmation of their narrative. Instead, they received discipline in public form. They received art where they anticipated chaos. The newspapers the next morning struggled with language. Harlem responds with street concert. No fires, no violence, no spectacle. Just unity. But pressure, when embarrassed, often makes one final attempt. 2 nights later, Clarence received another visit. This time, the men did not offer opportunity. They offered warning. "You're pushing the wrong direction," one of them said coolly. Public displays like that invite consequences. Clarence no longer trembled. "We didn't break anything," he replied evenly. "You're forcing attention." "Good." The man's jaw tightened. "Tell Johnson this is his last chance to stay quiet." Clarence met his gaze. He has been quiet. And that was the truth, because Bumpy had not shouted once. Not in court, not during audits, not after betrayal, not after fire. His power had never been noise. It had been consistency. The next morning, something unexpected happened. A building inspector arrived at Miss Evelyn's hall, not to close it, but to expedite repairs. Insurance claims processed unusually fast. Permits approved without delay. Downtown had recalculated, because continuing escalation against visible discipline risked exposure. Mayor, who remembered their last conversation, understood optics. And optics had shifted. The fire had not isolated Harlem. It illuminated it. Weeks later, the rebuilt music hall reopened. New piano, stronger stage, fresh paint. The reopening was not extravagant. It was intentional. When David played that night, the room felt different, deeper, rooted. Miss Evelyn stood beside Bumpy near the entrance. "You could have fought," she said quietly. "Yes, you could have exposed them. Yes, you didn't." "No." She studied him. "Why?" He looked toward the stage. "Because anger would have made this about destruction." A pause. "Rebuilding makes it about endurance." The music swelled, richer than before. Clarence approached slowly. "They backed down," he said quietly. "For now," Bumpy replied. "Do you think they'll try again?" "Yes," Clarence absorbed that. "And we'll respond the same way?" Bumpy's eyes remained steady. "As long as discipline serves us better than rage." The hall filled with applause as David finished. Not wild, not chaotic. Earned. Outside, winter still held Harlem in its grip, but inside, warmth had returned. Not because injustice had disappeared, not because power structures had transformed, but because the community had learned something irreversible. They could be tested without collapsing. They could be pressured without dividing. They could lose without becoming what others expected. And at the center of that realization stood a man who never raised his voice, not because he lacked strength, but because he understood something few ever do. Power, when loud, seeks validation. Power, when quiet, reshapes outcomes. Bumpy Johnson did not win by crushing opponents. He won by refusing to become one. Years later, people would not remember the audit threats. They would not remember the staged arrest. They would not even remember the fire in detail. They would remember the street concert. They would remember the calm walk out of court. They would remember the young man corrected without humiliation. They would remember the piano rising from ash. Because spectacle fades, but dignity stays. And in a city that often mistook noise for authority, Harlem learned the truth. The strongest man in the room is the one who does not need to prove it. Power was never loud. Power was quiet, and quiet, when disciplined, cannot be broken.